Hello and welcome to Beyond the Box Score, episode 25. Trayvon Hastings, Joey Korsnowski here, as always, to this time around cover what has happened so far in March Madness. What are our overall thoughts about the bracket, how things have shaped up, any surprising teams or results that have not only floored our brackets, but also just, moved the landscape of college basketball. We'll also talk about North Carolina and the Hubert Davis rumors that are flooding around. What is his job status moving forward, as well as a different topic Joey would like to discuss, which is the concept of the regular season champ getting the auto bid for mid majors rather than the postseason tournament team, for the simple fact of valuing the regular season. And we can get into that when we get there. And then if we have time, we will discuss the collapsed lung of Cade Cunningham and how that shapes up the rest of the Eastern Conference as we're finally in the home stretch of the NBA regular season. As a Kings fan, there's 10 games left, and I'm disappointed because we have gone from first in lottery odds to fourth in lottery odds. So I expect a lot of tanking in the last 10 games. And the Kings have been trying to tank, but their young players are actually playing quite well, so they're winning more games than they should. So we won't talk about the Kings, but we will talk about March Madness. What has stuck out to you in regards to not only this past weekend, but I guess that is the opening weekend, but the round of 64 games, the round of 32 games, and now to the point where we're at right now with the Sweet 16.
Yeah, so obviously everybody is talking about the lack of upsets, outside of High Point, talking about how their Cinderellas are dead. And honestly, to an extent, I think Cinderella, the traditional, mid-major Cinderella probably is dead, but I do think part of it is that we got kind of spoiled with multiple 16 seeds winning. We kind of got lucky with a couple 15 seeds winning and making runs. I mean, especially what was it, 2022, the year that like all one seeds were dead. And so we're kind of used to the chaos happening, but now it's a little bit of a different landscape. And honestly, I'm not mad at it. I'm not mad at the lack of upsets. I thought the first two rounds were great. Obviously, on the first day, you had High Point winning. The Friday was a little bland. I wouldn't say anything, too crazy happened there, really, outside of the Kentucky game to start off the day. But, you had a ton of close games, right? Siena gave Duke a run for their money. McNeese hung in there with Vanderbilt. Hofstra was in there with Bama. Akron, Texas Tech. Well, the final score was a little out of hand. It was a close game. Furman, I thought, went toe to toe with UConn. They looked pretty good. So, although we're not necessarily getting the actual upsets in the Cinderellas that really, make March Madness what we used to know it as, I still think it's a good thing for the fans. I obviously we'll get your thoughts on it too, but I was really engaged with it. I was very entertained, very fascinated by really everything that went on. I mean, I think you are going to start to see more Cinderellas be the lower seeded high major teams like an Iowa or like a Texas. And I know we don't really want to look at Cinderellas as, these high major teams with budgets and how, 4 and 5 star recruits and, they're paying players. But look, fact of the matter is, I believe High Point is one of the, if not the highest spending mid major because they can afford it. I mean, we've all seen their basketball arena and their campus. I mean, it is phenomenal. It is extremely nice. So they can afford to pay their players. So you don't normally see schools like High Point like that spend and invest in their basketball program. But yeah, I think my main takeaway is that while Cinderellas are dead, I think we're just going to get a different form of it because while everybody wants to use NIL to kind of take away from the mid majors and say this is why they're dead, well, does Iowa beat the reigning champion Florida Gators, say 10, 15 years ago? I doubt it. Is the reigning champ losing in the second round? Because you just didn't have that parity back then. But now with NIL and the transfer portal, all of these, it really benefits the high majors more than it does the mid majors. But you're kind of seeing that now. I know we've only had one seed go down, but all of these one seeds are going to have tough paths. I mean, obviously Arizona's going to have to run into a red hot Arkansas team. Michigan still has some tough teams left on their side of the bracket, especially Alabama. They can put up points on anybody. St. John's, can they ride that game winning shot from their point guard to get the win over Kansas? Can they pull off something similar to Duke? So I think all these one seeds, it wouldn't shock me if another one of them loses here before we get to the Final Four, but I think that kind of is the result of where we're at in the college basketball world. So to wrap it up real quick, while the traditional mid-major Cinderella might be dead, I think we're going to see a little more Cinderellas out of the lower tier or lower seeded high majors, I should say.
Overall, relatively agree. I the argument for Iowa and the way that you mentioned them would be, from my perspective, I could have if I probably bet on the amount of people that said something to me about High Point getting to the Sweet 16 or High Point beating or winning at least one game in comparison to Iowa, there was probably more people that actually would have put High Point in their Sweet 16 in comparison to Iowa because they're playing that one seed in Florida. And this Hawkeyes team is a team that went 10-10 in conference play in the Big Ten. Not particularly flashy on paper or in the literal win loss, but they've got one of the best players in college basketball and one of the better coaches, I would argue, as well. So that combination definitely served its purpose against Florida. They're able to catch the defending champ reeling, and since 2017, nearly every defending champ actually has lost in the first weekend, and typically that second game, if not the Sweet 16 after that. So the unfortunate trend continues for defending champs. Obviously, UConn was the one team to right the ship, go back to back. But in terms of the overall bracket, I guess I would say that it was a little bit more upset friendly this year, at least in the opening weekend. Obviously, we don't have a ton of like chaos here in the Sweet 16, but we do have an 11 seed. We do have a 9 seed, like you've mentioned. I doubt very many people had Nebraska in the Sweet 16, despite them being a 4 seed. So I do think there's a lot of trending storylines to follow. I do think another 1 seed drops this weekend. I do think it is going to be Duke against St. John's. St. John's knocking off one of my Final Four teams, Kansas. And then I just would like to thank the basketball world for that because, well, I believe I lost 2 of my Final Four teams because I also had Florida beating Illinois in the Elite Eight. So, yes, I have Illinois beating Houston, and now that opens up the can of worms for my bracket to inevitably crumble. I need my national champion, Arizona, to break the curse of the national champion line in the middle of the country and be the first West Coast team to win this thing in a very long period of time. So, I think the strength of the bracket and where it lies. So like if you open up your March Madness Live app, your ESPN Tournament Challenge app, and you look at the bottom 2 regions, your Purdue's, Iowa State's, Michigan's, Arizona's, I I do lean that direction for who's going to win the national championship out of that group of teams. You can throw Arkansas in there as well. You can even maybe throw a bone at Alabama or Tennessee, but I think the strength of the bracket so far is going to be in that bottom half. The top half, I think, has a little bit more chaos to it, a lot more intrigue, maybe, because that's very Big Ten friendly. Illinois, Nebraska, you've got Michigan State. The list goes on and on and on. Iowa as well. So I do think this is shaping up to be potentially the year for the Big Ten to break its national championship curse, as they've got 6 of the 16 Sweet 16 teams, 4 from the SEC as well. So those 2 conferences combining for 10 of the 16 teams in the Sweet 16. And there will be a guaranteed one that moves on in the Big Ten because 2 of those teams play each other in Iowa and Nebraska. So I do think there's some intriguing storylines. They're not going to be flashy ones. Like, not everybody, it's probably not going to be that many people tuning into the likely 57-52 game that Iowa and Nebraska are going to play, but it is going to be one of the better games still. It is a rivalry. It's just, I don't want to say old school Big Ten because Nebraska is a relatively new member to the Big Ten, but in terms of geographically, it is an old time rivalry. I know those 2 teams are going to be fired up, and I just can't help but think we're going to have a really wacky Final Four this year. Obviously, there's not going to be 4 1 seeds with Florida losing. I don't even know if there's going to be 2 1 seeds in there. I do think we'll get at least 1, maybe 2, but that's dependent on Michigan beating Iowa State. Obviously, both those teams having to get there as well, and then also Arizona getting there, not losing to Purdue or someone of that nature. So overall, I think the bracket was a little bit more intriguing this year. I think it proved last year was more of a one-off in the first weekend. Now, moving forward into the Sweet 16, the Elite Eight, the Final Four, I do agree with you where the teams that are remaining that are a little bit lower seeded are probably going to be your Power 4, Power 5 schools, if we include the Big East, who maybe had a down year, maybe they, can still pay for these players or whatever the case may be, but they're not highly regarded in terms of making a tournament run, which includes Iowa, that includes Nebraska, that includes a team like Texas, who I was questioning why at times if they even should have been in with their record and what the resume was, but they've proven themselves. They've got a good head coach in Sean Miller. They've got a ton of weapons offensively they can go to, and they also fried my bracket when I, of course, decided to put Gonzaga in my Elite Eight this year, and they lose. So I want to thank Mark Few once again for being a just unfortunate letdown in March. I just, it's really frustrating. 27 years Gonzaga's made the tournament in a row, and 27 years they do not have a national championship. They've actually appeared in the national championship, I believe, twice. So that's a whole nother conversation for Gonzaga, but I do overall agree with the sentiment that you put out for March. One of those teams that was in March Madness, North Carolina, they're not under scrutiny necessarily, but their head coach is Hubert Davis, as this program, this once just top of the line, prestigious blue blood program in North Carolina, has kind of fallen on its face here in the last few years. They've made the tournament for the last 5 years. They even went to a national championship in that time, but not a lot to show for Hubert Davis and his staff and the North Carolina program in terms of what that job should truly entail, where it should be at in comparison to where it truly is.
Yeah, and I think this could be kind of the start of a couple of big jobs that could be opening up. Kansas could very well open up. I think that would immediately jump at the top of the line. Um, but yeah, I would expect North Carolina here to go big game hunting. I mean, I feel like you have to. Now, a lot of people have thrown out the name Dan Hurley. I do not think that's going to happen. I mean, if he didn't take the Lakers job, he ain't leaving UConn. I think it'll be interesting just to see if they could try and lure some of these other guys, from their jobs, current jobs, over to North Carolina. Because look, let's be real. I mean, this is probably one of the top jobs in the country. Despite the lack of success recently. Obviously in Hubert Davis, I mean, you had really really big shoes to fill. After Roy Williams left, and that's never easy to do. Very very rarely do you see, college basketball programs just kind of continued success through coaching changes like Duke did, going from Coach K to John Shire. I mean, that's just really unheard of. It just doesn't happen that often. You see Ohio State; they kind of struggled to keep basketball relevance, through switching coaches. I know Michigan. I feel like they did a pretty decent job of keeping relative success through. I know they weren't quite the same. The Dusty May, feels like has really taken that program, up to the next level, which I don't think anybody is surprised over. So. Yeah, I think for North Carolina, I think you absolutely have to go big game hunting. I'll be interested to see who they go after. Again, do they try and get a guy like Dan Hurley, and does he entertain that idea? Because again, if he turned down the Lakers, I can't imagine that he would leave UConn. You play in, I don't want to say an easier conference because I'm not that high on the ACC, but let's be real, the ACC and the Big East are probably two of the lower tier power conferences, especially in basketball. So, but that could also be part of it, right? Do a lot of guys who are looking at the job, do they, especially if they go for somebody younger, do they look at North Carolina and be like, they got resources, yeah, they're a big brand, but you play in a bit of a weaker conference, they might like the opportunity elsewhere. So we'll see, because again, like I said, if Kansas opens up, I think Kansas immediately jumps to the top of the line. But yeah, I'm fascinated to see where North Carolina goes with this.
And this obviously requires North Carolina to actually fire Hubert Davis first, or maybe Hubert Davis resigns, retires, whatever the case may be. There's been rumblings from individuals from the Field of 68, for example, for those who follow them on YouTube, that Hubert never actually wanted the job, but Roy Williams handpicked him because typically the UNC head coaches, they fall in line, they're part of the family, they've, in some way, shape, or form affected the program previously, and that's what was the case for Hubert Davis. And it just seems off to me that somebody who played in the NBA and has tons of coaching experience hasn't necessarily got it to work at a program such as North Carolina. And yes, a lot of the top recruits, at least in the past, had the tendency to basically automatically you could, pencil them in at Duke, You could pencil them in at Kentucky. And at times, guys would go to Kansas or guys would go to North Carolina, kind of those secondary blue bloods. I don't want to say secondary, but in terms of the NBA prestige and demise and the chance to go be number one, it's usually Duke and Kentucky. And so it doesn't help North Carolina that their top rival is Duke, and Duke is flourishing with John Shire, another guy who was, I would say, handpicked by Coach K. There's a lot of parallels with Duke and North Carolina. One program is flourishing, the other is not. So I'll be fascinated to see what happens there. You mentioned Ohio State. It's actually very funny you mentioned them because in front of me here I have this graphic that I saw today, and I was like, wow, this really puts it into perspective. So, Ohio State has 38 20 win seasons. They've got 22 conference regular season titles, 5 conference tournament titles, and then they've got 36 NCAA tournament appearances, 8 Sweet 16s, 11 Final Fours, and a championship record of 1-3 when they do get to the national championship. Now, if you want to compare that to the Cincinnati Bearcats basketball program, Cincinnati has more 21 seasons at 41. They've got more conference regular season titles at 25. They've also got more conference tournament titles at 12. Cincinnati, though, has 33 tournament appearances, which is less than Ohio State, less Sweet 16s with just 4, and less Final Fours with just 6. However, in championship games, they have a better record at 2-1. So, looking at just Ohio State, this is a sidebar to this, but they're a little bit more on par and parallel with a program like Cincinnati, who isn't it's not like it's not going to pop off to people, but Cincinnati once was a very, very just prestigious basketball place to play and go to, and they've had a lot of success with previous NBA players as well. So I do think that's just something for Ohio State fans to kind of let sink in while they want their basketball program to be what the football program is, because it tends to not be that way. A lot of these schools are going to either prioritize one sport or the other. So now's a good chance for teams like Ohio State or the North Carolinas or whoever. Like, which sport are you going to prioritize? Or are you going to try to fund both? Obviously, with North Carolina, Bill Belichick in there for football now, it seems like the basketball program has kind of taken a step back when I actually think, despite Bill Belichick being there, the top program needs to be the basketball program. That's what people think of when they hear UNC, when they see the Tar Heels, when you talk North Carolina. Like, that is North Carolina. So I do think they'll be able to get back. I don't know who they would bring in to necessarily take over for Hubert Davis. There's really only one other person in terms of the North Carolina idea of the family that would make sense, which is Wes Miller. But Wes Miller just got fired from Cincinnati and then took another job. So he's off the board. So they're going to have to go outside of the family, get creative, maybe try to snag somebody. And I like that you brought up Kansas, because this very well could be Bill Self's last year coaching. He's had a couple of health scares in the last few years, family as well. And it also just feels like Kansas is starting to not fall flat, but in terms of March Madness, they've become very stagnant. They now, for the 4th straight time in the NCAA tournament, did not make it out of the first weekend. I do think that speaks volumes for maybe needing a new face. Then that's nothing against Bill Self. He's one of the best coaches in college basketball. It's more so about it may just be time for someone new to come in there, a changing of the guard type of moment. So I do think there's a chance to have 2 of the top jobs in college basketball open this summer, or at least this offseason, and that would be, I think, great for the sport. I know we could talk the mid-major thing, which we'll get to in a second, but it uh, college basketball isn't the same without like those top programs being what they are. I still think of, the Kentuckys and stuff. Like, we naturally have this expectation they're gonna be, a 1, 2, 3 seed come March. UConn's back in terms of that. Kentucky is not in terms of that. But you have Duke, you have Michigan, you have Arizona. Like, you've got some very prototypical blue blood type of schools that are almost always at the top of the sport, and there's reasons for that. So I do think for the ones that aren't, like the Kentuckys or the North Carolinas or the even Kansas to an extent, what are you going to do to stand out and get back to where you used to be? What is that going to look like? So it'll be fascinating to watch moving forward, and hopefully we get the results we would like to see for those programs moving forward. But since we kind of talked about this, we can now discuss it. You had highlighted that, and I've also seen this, but for mid majors specifically, you believe the regular season champ should be given the auto bid, not the postseason tournament champion, because over the 30 game period, it feels like there's a little bit more value and a lot more to offer up for a resume in comparison to maybe a postseason tournament run from a mid major that, let's say, is the 5, 6, or 7 seed in the conference but got hot. So I want to hear your thoughts on this overall, and then I'll give my 2 cents. I'm relatively in agreement, but there might be a few tweaks I have. So let's hear it.
Yeah, I will say the only problem is I understand why the conference champ is awarded the auto bid to the tournament because you want that tournament to have some sort of significance, and I think the NCAA has done a great job of putting this type of importance into conference tournaments. But when you see the results, I mean, we're just not getting the best teams in the tournament. I mean, when you think of the Ivy League, Yale was very clearly the best team in the Ivy League all year. Well, Penn pulls off a great performance in the championship game. They get rewarded into the tournament. And this is the hard part. Like, I don't want to take anything away from Penn, but I do think Yale would have been much more of a threat to anybody in the tournament, compared to Penn. Even you look at some of the other conferences. Like, take a look at the Big Sky. Idaho went 9-9. In conference in the regular season, Central Arkansas or Portland State rather went 13-5. Idaho got hot in the tournament, and they made their run and they got into the tournament. Even some of these other conferences like the CAA, UNC Wilmington, Charleston, top two teams in the conference all year. Hofstra was 12-6 in the conference, so they still deserve their spot. But you get hot in the tournament and you essentially kind of erase everything that happened over the course of the regular season. Like even like a team like Miami, they had their undefeated regular season, but they didn't really have any benefit besides playing a lower seed in their conference tournament. But we clearly see in March on these neutral floors, the margins are razor thin more than they ever have been. So UMass and Miami, of course it's going to be a close game, and Miami just wasn't on the right side. Of course, I think it did work out for the MAC because if Miami would have won that tournament, I don't think they would have gotten 2 bids. But still, even in the Conference USA, Liberty went 17-3 in conference. Kennesaw went 10-10. They won the tournament and they got in. Even Belmont, they lost on the first day of the tournament. So I mean, there's so many conferences where I just don't think we're getting the best team in. And we talked about it a little bit. The lack of upsets and the lack of Cinderellas. I think this might be part of it. And it hasn't necessarily been a problem in the past. But when you have these top seeded high major teams are better than they ever have been, due to all of the reasons that we talked about, NIL, the transfer portal. It's just so hard for a middle of the pack mid major to compete. It's already hard enough for the top of the line mid majors to compete. Teams like Yale, Belmont, they should have absolutely been in the tournament. I think it's just a disservice to the tournament as a whole. But this is the hard part, right? I don't want to take anything away from an Idaho or a Kennesaw State or a Penn because they earn their way in there absolutely under the current rules and the current format. They absolutely earn their way in. So I just think if you want to see more upsets and you want to truly get the best teams in the tournament, I think we need to bank on the regular season auto bid. Now, I've seen some people throw around the idea of getting in both the regular season champ and the conference tournament champ, but I mean, at that point you'd have to expand the tournament, or so some teams are going to get left out. I think that's a little bit tough. And if you go to the regular season auto bid, then what's really the point of playing the conference tournament? Oh yeah, we're conference tournament champs, but you don't make the tournament. What's the point? But then again, you could on the flip side you can make the same argument. Oh yeah, we're regular season conference champs. Well, it doesn't really mean anything because you have to win these 3 games here on a neutral floor. Well, put everything aside in the past. So I think if the goal is to truly get the best teams in the conference, I think that we should do the regular season champs get the auto bid.
Another team that you did not mention was Navy, who in the Patriot League went 26-8, 17-1 in conference play, and inevitably we saw Lehigh make a run. They did finish second in the conference, but they won the conference tournament and they ended up playing in the first four of the tournament of March. So it definitely changes things because, for example, Navy at 26-8 probably isn't even a 16. They probably make Navy a 14 or a 15. Like it completely changes the seed lines 100%. And that's obviously just one of the many that you mentioned, and I'm sure there's some that also haven't even been mentioned if we sit down and like think about it and look at it. But I mean, overall, I would make the argument for the mid majors that if they're going to go that route and roll with the regular season tournament champ getting the auto bid, at that point you just relinquish the conference tournament and you replace that time or you fill that time with more games, for example, if you can, right? So I think there's a way around it. I do think it's attainable, for sure. But with that being said, these conferences have to be willing to do that. I'm just looking around at some of these conferences to see, like, okay, so Hawaii, second in the Big West Conference. They did finish behind UC Irvine, who got off to a blazing hot start to the year. They did fall off at the end. So I would say Hawaii is still the overall best team in that conference, but it just leaves you wondering like what could be, right? Like UNC Wilmington, 27-7. They have been very good for a very long period of time here. Not a lot of tournament appearances to show for it though, because per usual in the CAA, they have fallen short at some point. The Ivy League is a good example of this. They haven't always done a postseason tournament. When they had not, the regular season team just got the auto bid, if that makes sense. So even looking at the Horizon League, like very competitive league. So I think if any of these teams won it wouldn't be much of an argument. But Wright State was the top team. They did finish on top. Robert Morris second. We saw what Robert Morris did last year in the tournament, giving Alabama a run for their money there for just a period of time. The MAAC, where Rick Pitino used to coach at Iona, another good example. Siena gets in. They finished third in the conference. The best team in the league, though, was 17-3, 23-11 overall. Merrimack, who honestly, like a lot of these other schools we've talked about, have like ran through their conference in the regular season. So I do feel like that should be rewarded in some way, shape, or form. They do recognize every conference recognizes the regular season tournament champ, but when it comes to actually like rewarding them, the reward is simply either a bye or hey, you still got to play in the conference tournament. So the one way to get around that would be potentially guaranteeing the regular season conference champ either a championship appearance in the conference tournament, or you could, guarantee them a spot in the semis. They got to win that game and then the next. There are ways around it that I do think are intriguing. So it's just something to keep in mind for these schools. I do think there's ways to improve upon it. Another league, you mentioned Belmont, but Bradley as well. The Missouri Valley Conference was very deep this year. And so for Northern Iowa to make a run and get to the tournament was impressive in itself. But easily, if Belmont wins the tournament, they're probably the team on that 12 seed line, not Northern Iowa. I don't think Northern Iowa should have even been a 12 seed to begin with. That's a different conversation, but the 12s look a lot different if instead of Northern Iowa, it's Belmont. And if instead of a team like McNeese, who was very, very good, elite, I will say, you could argue, though, McNeese wasn't even the best team in their conference because in the Southland Conference, they had Stephen F. Austin in there as well. Stephen F. Austin was actually a game better in conference play. They were also 28-6. So, like, some conferences like that, where there's just two teams definitively better than the rest in the conference, I do think it's worth the consideration of getting them both into the tournament. Obviously, that would require expansion, or that would require, hey, the regular season champ gets the auto, which would be Stephen F. Austin, and then the conference champ also gets it, that being McNeese. So just a few things to think about that maybe could be tweaked or rectified moving forward, but Unfortunately, that will more than likely require expansion of March Madness, which I think a lot of us don't want. I also don't think it's needed because if we were to expand the field, a team like basically 500 Auburn gets into the field this year because that's just how middling the bubble was. So that's when you get a lot of those wishy-washy schools that didn't honestly deserve to be in the tournament get into the tournament because it's expanded. Similar to what would be a college football playoff argument as they have continued to expand it. So we'll see. I'm opposed to expanding March Madness, but I'm not opposed to tweaking the regular season versus conference champion aspect. Whether that's those two then facing off for the actual final auto bid, whatever it may be, but I do think it's a hot topic that will likely get addressed by at least maybe one conference in the off season. We'll find out, but since we've got about 5 minutes or so, we have time to talk about the collapsed lung of Cade Cunningham. It's a mild case, which means he's going to miss essentially the rest of the regular season. He should be back for the playoffs, but can't really say that too definitively because it's a collapsed lung. They're very tricky and painful. So how do you think this shapes up the East? Obviously, you being a Cavs fan, this is something for you to monitor, not something for me to monitor because the team I root for isn't even in the Eastern Conference. But I do think it creates some intrigue for how this conference could shape up. Detroit is 5 games ahead of the second place Boston Celtics, who are half a game ahead of the Knicks, who are in third, and then you have the Cavs at 8 games back, Toronto at 12, Atlanta at 12 and a half, and then your play-in teams are actually Philadelphia, Orlando, Miami, and Charlotte. Charlotte has been on fire since the first month of the year, and despite that, they're still in the 10 seed position. Orlando's fallen off a little bit. Philadelphia's gotten things going, but if you look at the Eastern Conference standings, all these teams are actually above 500 for like the first time in some years now. So I do think the East could be very, very fun to watch in the playoffs.
Yeah, it's going to be loaded. Like, let's be honest. I know we always think of like the East as kind of the loaded team, but there are a ton of exciting teams here in the East. I mean, even just look at this play-in, right? And this might be the first year of the play-in where the Bulls aren't going to be in it. And even the Hawks might not be in it, but yeah, like Charlotte, Philly, it's a great play-in game. Orlando, Miami, it's a great play-in game. So I mean, either way, well, in terms of Detroit, I don't think losing Cade is going to hurt them in terms of their playoff seeding. I think that they are still going to get the first seed. They're going to finish with a great record. But I got to be honest with you, I didn't really, as a Cavs fan, I didn't really take the Pistons all that seriously as a finals contender, even with Cade. So the Lakers lost to the Pistons last night. I think that pretty much all but locks up the 1 seed for the Pistons. And as a Cavs fan, I'm kind of happy with that because then, now that means that if they get through, right now would be the Raptors in the first round, you get the Pistons in the second round. I think all Cavs fans are taking that over playing, say, Boston in the second round because I just think that's a much better chance for the Cavs. They're going to be overwhelming favorites over the Pistons in a series. I think that's just it's a better path for them because the Cavs need to at least make the Eastern Conference Finals this year. They've bowed out in the second round the past couple of years, and it's been ugly. It has not gone the way that the Cavs want, but I think this is the best team that the Cavs have had in recent years. But there still are questions to whether or not they can truly contend for a finals, mainly because you see them blow games like they did against Detroit a couple of weeks ago. I know they bounced back after that, but they have not been able to beat the Celtics this year. They blew the game against the Knicks on Christmas Day. But either way, I do think that this injury for Detroit, I don't really think it changes much for me. Just because I wasn't all that high on Detroit as it was already. Now, if somebody on the outside might have thought that the Pistons were, if they really thought that Cade was going to get them to a finals, and just Cade and Duren alone was going to be enough to carry them through multiple prolonged series and to the finals, then maybe they might be panicking a little more. But I just think overall this just sucks because obviously as a Cavs fan, I did not want to beat a decimated even Boston. Like, I'm happy that Tatum came back, although I think he's kind of making their offense worse. I think they had the second-ranked offense before he came back. Now I want to say it's like about 16, so right around middle of the pack now that he came back. But nonetheless, I don't want to beat a team that's not at full strength. As the basketball fan in me wants to see all these teams at full strength, and I thought Cade was in MVP conversations, but now this injury is kind of putting a damper on that. So I without Cade, obviously, I think the Pistons are kind of dead in the water. I mean, depending who they play in the play-in, I think that one of those teams could give them some trouble with no Cade. It depends if Dennis Jenkins is going to continue to play the way he is. He's playing phenomenal right now, by the way. But I don't know if we'll be able to do that in a playoff series. It's just too much unknown for me right now. So I think it's very clearly the Cavs and Boston as the top two teams in the conference.
So Detroit has 11 games left in the regular season. 8 of those are against playoff teams. So I know the precipitous fall for Detroit may not happen, but I do think it is a possibility considering, let's say they drop 3 or 4 of those. That's already you're already giving the chance for Boston or New York to climb up, maybe get a 1 seed, maybe get the 2 seed, and this is going to require the Pistons to finish this home stretch hard and very effectively with some momentum going into the playoffs, where I don't think these first round games are going to be as easy for some of these top tier teams in the East, because the bottom part of the East has actually been very good this year. And if you look at it in comparison to the Western Conference, it's the Eastern Conference with all teams above 500, whereas the Western Conference, this would be the year for the West to not have the play-in altogether, being completely transparent here. But that then transitions into a point I was going to make about the play-in, which is that I feel like the play-in has been interesting. It's been intriguing at times. It's definitely created some suspense as well at the bottom half of those playoff seeding spots. But I think the plan should only be initiated if, let's say, teams 9 and 10 are within a certain amount of games from teams 8 and 7 and 8. So let's say teams 9 and 10 are within 4 or 5 games of teams 7 and 8. That initiates the plan. And then therefore you can go from there, have the plan, and it be worthwhile because they're all teams within the same competitive atmosphere. It's going to be a competitively balanced plan. Whereas now it could be literally you could have 29 wins, be 10th in the East, and you're going to be in the play-in. You shouldn't be in the play-in, but you're going to deserve it. So I do think there's a way to tweak the plan to make it a little bit more intriguing for all parties involved, fans, the league, and these teams. But with that in mind, I do think Detroit's probably a second-round exit either way, so it doesn't really change the overall outlook. But I do think in terms of that first round, it's going to be important that they're going to have home court either way. But I do think they should be trying to size up these teams in the play-in and think about who they may or may not want to face. Obviously, they can't really dictate that because the play-in is going to dictate who goes where. But, for example, a team like Atlanta, who is 6th right now, I think I would rather play Atlanta and their very young, unproven roster, at least from a playoff perspective, than I would play Philadelphia or I would play Orlando, because Philadelphia has, out of all those teams in that bottom half of the East that are going to make the playoffs, Philadelphia has by far the most talent when they're healthy. And I think if they were fully healthy, they probably are at least in the top 5 of the East. I do think that's a guarantee. As Charles Barkley would say, I can guarantee it. Like, I would probably guarantee that one. You do have to be wary of Charlotte because their offense has been elite since they've gotten this thing going after the last month of the year. But despite that, they are still just 37 and 34, so they've kind of evened out. They've become even kill there. So I do think their inexperience could also be crucial in what happens for them in the postseason. And then you have teams like Orlando and Miami who are just the barn-burning type of classic teams. Orlando is very solid defensively per usual, so I mean they're going to muck things up. If they can in the playoffs. We saw this with the Cavs as well. Thought Orlando might squeak out that series because of that. Probably would have if Franz Wagner didn't have the worst game I've ever seen in a Game 7. And then Miami. They are another team that has the talent to do it. Do they have the depth? Not really sure. And for teams like Miami and Orlando, it's very much matchup based. And I think out of all those teams up top, I would rather play Detroit than Boston, New York, and Cleveland. I think any team is going to want to play anybody but those three. Toronto has been very good, but they're very uncertain on how they're going to play in the playoffs. I really like their core. I really like what they've built. I just don't know how they're going to perform in a postseason setting. The same can be said for Atlanta. The same can be said for Charlotte. But I think the teams to watch are definitely Philadelphia, Orlando, and Miami from the play-in. I know that's three of the four, but those would be the teams that could make something happen in the first round. So I think this injury doesn't really hamper Detroit's final stretch of the season, but it could definitely cause them to lose a round earlier if Cade isn't back at the beginning of the playoffs, which I presume he will be. So they'll play in the second round, probably play Cleveland if they can beat Toronto, and we'll go from there. But if Cleveland loses and Toronto advances, for example, then we can talk about Detroit making the Eastern Conference Finals, because I do think that is a possibility. You don't just win 52 games as of right now, like just breezing by. Obviously, they've earned those 52 wins. They've proven they're a very good basketball team despite their flaws. It just doesn't feel like a playoff roster. It feels like a regular season roster. Kind of like those old Atlanta Hawks teams or Toronto Raptors teams when LeBron was in his second stint in Cleveland. Very elite regular season teams. It was just a problem in the postseason because they couldn't play the type of basketball they needed to advance further. And by advance further, I mean beat LeBron. So that's kind of my overall thoughts.
Yeah, and as we've seen, the playoffs are a completely different animal. Well, as a Cavs fan, I would know this better than anybody. I mean, what you do in the regular season, yeah, it matters, and yeah, you want to win as many games as possible. You want to look good, but sometimes you completely have to change up what you're doing in the playoffs, and some teams cannot adapt to that. One last thing I'll add though is I feel really bad for JB Bickerstaff, man. I mean, it just seems like from his Cavs tenure to now with Detroit, I mean, this guy just can't catch a break, man. He's a phenomenal regular season coach. He's phenomenal at bringing teams up from the bottom. He does a great job of bringing a young nucleus together and getting them to mold and play together and build that good team chemistry. If you have to really see him get over the hump in the playoffs, that's why the Cavs moved off him. But even in his time when he was with the Cavs, Jared Allen got injured in the playoffs. Darius Garland got injured in the playoffs. Donovan Mitchell was running on fumes at one point. I believe Evan Mobley missed some time as well. So this guy's injury luck has just been so brutal. And I really do think that he is a good coach. I liked him when he was in Cleveland. I like him now with Detroit. He's got the young guys playing really, really well. He did the same thing in Cleveland. So I just feel terrible because this is probably the best chance that he's had in a very long time to make a run at the finals, because the way that Cade and Jalen Duren were playing were really good. Now, obviously, me and you can sit here and we can nitpick the Pistons roster and stack them up to the rest of the teams in the East, but if you're JB, man, you really got to feel like you just continually get the short end of the stick and you just can't catch a break.
I agree. He has proven to be a very good coach in the NBA. Obviously, we have our tiers of coaches, and the more elite ones get it done in the postseason because they know how to adjust. So JB Bickerstaff has kind of been yet to do that in the playoffs, but he has a chance here with a very young Pistons group that I don't want to say is not elite at either side of the ball. They're not flashy. They don't have a lot of shooting. They're able to muck things up. They've got some physicality, but they've also got one of the best facilitators in the league and one of the better young big men in Jalen Duren that they can rely upon. So obviously they're going to be a force to be reckoned with, but it's not going to be the same without Cade. So we'll have to monitor his situation moving forward. But that'll honestly conclude the episode. We didn't have a whole lot to talk about. Obviously, we've got the Sweet 16 games this upcoming weekend and Elite Eight games, therefore, as well. We'll probably then come back next week, preview the Final Four, take our overall thoughts from this upcoming weekend as well. And then we've got opening day around the corner. Opening day around the corner. Kevin McGonigal officially has made the Tigers opening day roster. I'm very excited for that. We could use the extra pop from the bats. So we'll talk about some baseball when that time comes. NHL playoffs are going to be around the corner as well. So stay tuned for more, at least next week for sure. TBD for this week. But with that, that'll conclude episode 25 of Beyond the Box Score. Both Trayvon Hastings and Joey Korzanowski here. As always, want to thank everybody for tuning in, listening, wherever they are, doing that from whatever platform it is. Like, subscribe, share, comment, whatever it is you do on that various platform. We appreciate the love and support. Interact as well. We enjoy the interactions, so feel free to if you have any thoughts. But other than that, we'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for tuning in.